You are listening to Despair by Michael Brockbank. Episode 23. Tessa sat and waited for her father's arrival. It was customary to give her a bit of time to use her gifts to see the truth from someone's belongings. Then, he would enter the room after a sufficient time had passed to hear the verdict. Afterward, he would order Tessa to her room on the second floor and away from the parlor. This time was much different, however. She felt as though there was more at stake than just profits made from spice. It was as though the very fabric of existence was vibrating all around her. As she waited for Caldwell, she again began thinking if there was any way she could lie to him to save Frederick. She bowed her head, looking down at the coat. Tessa already knew the answer, and the whisper was correct. It would mean suffering his wrath once again, and this time he might not stop at just a broken arm. Footsteps. He was coming. Tessa took in a deep breath and tilted her head back, trying to gain a bit of composure. She didn't know why she was so connected to Frederick in such a manner. Sure, she always felt terrible about the people her stepfather had hurt over the years. Yet, she couldn't avoid the feeling that this time was more distinctive than the others. Caldwell opened the door and entered the room. He already had a scowl on his face as he could tell Frederick had been lying about something. While Caldwell didn't share Tessa's gifts, he still had a decent sense of intuition and could read people quite well. "Well," he said, looking down at the young girl. It was her last chance to reconsider and lie to her stepfather. "Don't," the whisper insisted. Taking a deep breath, she began to relay everything she saw, including the conversation with the smaller man. As she continued the brief tale, Tessa could see how infuriated Caldwell was becoming. His fists clenched and his cheeks flushed. It was a fury that she had seen and felt all too often from her stepfather. After Tessa finished recanting what she saw, Caldwell took a moment to relax. He unclenched his fist, and the color was returning to his face. "Thank you, dear. Now, go to your room and shut the door," Caldwell ordered, taking the coat from Tessa. He stood aside to let her out of the room. As was part of the custom, he would ensure she was well on her way up the stairs before returning to the parlor. Although he had been violent with her on several occasions, he still sheltered her from the conversations he would have with his next victim. She walked over to the window of her room, overlooking the back lot of the property. It was a beautiful garden that Tessa had spent a lot of time playing in over the years, and she often found comfort focusing on happier times on nights like that. With each flash of the lightning above, Tessa could see glimpses of the magnificent grounds that Caldwell spent a lot of gold creating. "This needs to end," she said to herself as a tear streamed down her cheek. "Leave," the whisper replied. Did she dare leave the manor? She felt she was old enough to take care of herself, especially with the gifts she possessed. If Tessa left, then Caldwell would have a far more difficult time murdering people who crossed him. Leaving might save so many lives in the end. Where would she go? Everyone in Wiltshire knew who she was, and most of them would give her up to save themselves from Caldwell's wrath. Tessa was quite apt at avoiding people, which is how she was able to sneak away from her bodyguard to visit the pond outside of town. But this would be much different and much more dangerous, especially if she had been caught and brought back to her stepfather. Another flash of lightning lit up the garden. "Riley," she whispered to herself. A knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. Tessa recognized the knock from anywhere, as Yarn was the only one who cared to do so. Her stepfather would simply barge in regardless. She walked over to open the door for the old man. "Miss, I brought you some tea. You looked distraught earlier," the old man said. Yarn was holding a silver platter with a cup of steaming hot tea. He was always kind to Tessa, and often tried to intervene when Caldwell would lose his temper. those days were diminishing rapidly as his health declined. "Thank you, Yarn," she said, ushering the old man into her chambers. He walked over and placed the platter and glass on a desk near her window. "If you don't mind, miss, I've taken the liberty of preparing a bag," the old man said. "Bag? Bag for what?" she asked, closing the door behind her. "I've seen that look before, the one on your face right now. It was one your mother had almost a decade ago." What? She wanted to leave as well. "Do you know what happened to my mother?" she asked as tears began to well in her eyes once again. "Unfortunately, no. All I know is that your stepfather left with her and returned a few days later, alone." Over the years, Tessa had used her gifts on every item in the manor, trying to identify what had happened to her mother. Never once did she see her stepfather do anything nefarious, although a small piece of her always suspected he did something to her. "I need to leave, Yarn," she said in a hushed tone. "I know, miss. The bag is in the garden, under your mother's bench by the oak tree," he unflinchingly replied. Tessa's mother spent a great deal of time in the garden sitting on a specific bench overlooking a small stream. The two of them had shared a lot of happy moments there, and Tessa felt it was only fitting that's where her adventure would begin. "I'll miss you. Please, take care of yourself," Tessa said, walking over to Yarn. She wrapped her arms around him as gently as she could, considering he felt fragile enough to break. "Find your path, young one," he replied in her ear. Tessa waited several hours for her stepfather to return to his chamber. She had kept the door slightly ajar and watched for him to finally sleep. When Caldwell entered his chamber, which was much further down the hallway from her, Tessa watched the light from the lantern peering out from under the door. After what felt like just short of an eternity, the light finally disappeared. Her stepfather was well on his way to falling fast asleep. Tessa often found that her stepfather's snoring was a bane of her existence. It had kept her awake on several nights. That time, she thought of it as more of a salvation. For once Caldwell began snoring, nothing short of a violent assault would wake him. As the sounds of light snoring filled the hall, Tessa began her stealthy escape from her room. She had filled a rucksack of her own with clothing and a few keepsakes of her mother she refused to leave behind. Barefoot, with a sack strapped across her shoulder, she began to make her way across the hall, down the stairs, and toward the door to the garden. There were many trees that separated the Caldwell estate from the main roads leading to the heart of town. Tessa had made her way to one of the more obscure roads leading away from the manor within those trees after grabbing the sack Yarn had prepared. He packed quite a bit of food, a knife, and stashed away several gold coins at the bottom. It brought a tear to her eye as she knew Yarn didn't have a lot of gold to begin with. Her stepfather didn't really pay the help and simply let them live at the manor in trade of services. As she began to emerge from the tree line toward the road, she heard the sound of a wagon rolling up behind her. Tessa quickly dove back into the trees as she didn't want anyone to see her escape. Two men were pulling a large covered wagon and began to turn off the road heading toward the slums. "Caldwell said just to take this fella to the cliff, and that's all we're going to do," one of the men said. "All I'm saying is that I'm tired of doing this in the middle of the night, that's all," said the other man. "Taking a man to a cliff? Are they disposing of Frederick?" She leaned herself up against the trunk of the tree and began to wonder if perhaps she made the right decision. She looked back at the wagon being pulled along the road. "Then again, that could be me," she whispered to herself. Tessa sat still in the trees, waiting for the men to get further away. The dawn was still a long way from appearing, and she wanted to get out of Wellshire long before anyone spotted her leaving. As soon as she felt it was safe, Tessa began making her way toward the chemist shop, staying to as many shadows as she could. If Riley was leaving, Perhaps he would take her along.